Who would like to hear the story of a man who lost his eye and gained a better sight?
Something about the tone of his voice or the reaction of the other children told me this was a purely rhetorical question.
So, Lanre and the Creation War. An old story.
His eyes swept over the children.
Sit and listen, for I will speak of the shining city as it once was, years and miles away. Once, years and miles away, there was Myr Tariniel, the shining city. It sat among the tall mountains of the world, like a gem on the crown of a king. Imagine a city as large as Tarbean, but on every corner of every street there was a bright fountain, or a green tree growing, or a statue so beautiful it would make a proud man cry to look at it. The buildings were tall and graceful, carved from the mountain itself, carved of a bright white stone that held the sun's light long after evening fell. Selitos was lord over Myr Tariniel. Just by looking at a thing, Selitos could see its hidden name and understand it. In those days there were many who could do such things, but Selitos was the most powerful namer of anyone alive in that age. Selitos was well loved by the people he protected. His judgments were strict and fair, and none could sway him through falsehood or dissembling. Such was the power of his sight that he could read the hearts of men like heavy-lettered books. Now in those days, there was a terrible war being fought across a vast empire. The war was called the Creation War, and the empire was called Ergen. And despite the fact that the world has never seen an empire as grand or a war so terrible, both of them only live in stories now. Even history books that mention them as doubtful rumour have long since crumbled into dust. The war had lasted so long that folk could hardly remember a time when the sky wasn't dark with the smoke of burning towns. Once there had been hundreds of proud cities scattered through the empire. Now they were merely ruins littered with the bodies of the dead. Famine and plague were everywhere, and in some places there was such despair that mothers could no longer muster enough hope to give their children names. But 8 cities remained. They were Balen, Ansus, Viret, Tinusa, Emlyn, and the twin cities of Murilla and Murella. Last was Myr Tariniel, greatest of them all, and the only one unscarred by the long centuries of war. It was protected by the mountains and brave soldiers. But the true cause of Myr Tariniel's peace was Selitos. Using the power of his sight, he kept watch over the mountain passes leading to his beloved city. His rooms were in the city's highest towers, so he could see any attack long before it came to be a threat. The other 7 cities, lacking Selitos' power, found their safety elsewhere. They put their trust in thick walls, in stone and steel. They put their trust in strength of arm, in valour and bravery and blood. And so they put their trust in Lanre. Lanre had fought since he could lift a sword, and by the time his voice began to crack, he was the equal of a dozen older men. He married a woman named Lyra, and his love for her was a passion fiercer than fury. Lyra was terrible and wise, and held a power just as great as his. For while Lanre had the strength of his arm and the command of loyal men, Lyra knew the names of things, and the power of her voice could kill a man or still a thunderstorm. As the years passed, Lanre and Lyra fought side by side. They defended Balin from a surprise attack, saving the city from a foe that should have overwhelmed them. They gathered armies and made the cities recognize the need for allegiance. Over the long years, they pressed the Empire's enemies back. People who had grown numb with despair began to feel warm hope kindling inside. They hoped for peace, and they hung those flickering hopes on Lanre. Then came the Black of Drossen Tor. Black meant battle in the language of the time, and at Drossen Tor there was the largest and most terrible battle of this large and terrible war. They fought unceasing for 3 days in the light of the sun, and for 3 nights unceasing by the light of the moon. Neither side could defeat the other, and both were unwilling to retreat. Of the battle itself, I have only one thing to say. More people died at Drossen Tor than are living in the world today. Lanre was always where the fight was thickest, where he was needed most. His sword never left his hand or rested in its sheath. At the very end of things, covered in blood amid a field of corpses, Lanre stood alone against a terrible foe. It was a great beast with scales of black iron, whose breath was a darkness that smothered men. Lanre fought the beast and killed it. Lanre brought victory to his side, but he bought it with his life. After the battle was finished, and the enemy was set beyond the doors of stone, survivors found Lanre's body, cold and lifeless near the beast he had slain. Word of Lanre's death spread quickly, covering the field like a blanket of despair. They had won the battle and turned the tide of the war, but each of them felt cold inside. The small flame of hope that each of them cherished began to flicker and fade. Their hopes had hung on Lanre, and Lanre was dead. In the midst of silence, Lyra stood by Lanre's body and spoke his name. Her voice was a commandment. Her voice was steel and stone. Her voice told him to live again. But Lanre lay motionless and dead. In the midst of fear, Lyra knelt by Lanre's body and breathed his name. Her voice was a beckoning. Her voice was love and longing. Her voice called him to live again. But Lanre lay cold and dead. In the midst of despair, Lyra fell across Lanre's body and wept his name. Her voice was a whisper. Her voice was echo and emptiness. Her voice begged him to live again. But Lanre lay breathless and dead. Lanre was dead. Lyra wept brokenly and touched his face with trembling hands. All around, men turned their heads because the bloody field was less horrible to look upon than Lyra's grief. But Lanre heard her calling. Lanre turned at the sound of her voice and came to her. From beyond the doors of death, Lanre returned. He spoke her name and took Lyra in his arms to comfort her. He opened his eyes and did his best to wipe away her tears with shaking hands, and then he drew a deep and living breath. The survivors of the battle saw Lanre move, and they marveled. The flickering hope for peace each of them had nurtured for so long flared like hot fire inside them. Lanre and Lyra, they shouted, their voices like thunder. Our Lord's love is stronger than death. Our Lady's voice has called him back. Together they have beaten death. Together how can we help but be victorious? So the war continued. But with Lanre and Lyra fighting side by side, the future seemed less grim. Soon, everyone knew the story of how Lanre had died, and how his love and Lyra's power had drawn him back. For the first time in living memory, people could speak openly of peace without being seen as fools or madmen. Years passed. The Empire's enemies grew thin and desperate, and even the most cynical of men could see the end of the war was drawing swiftly near. Then rumours began to spread. Lyra was ill. Lyra had been kidnapped. Lyra had died. Lanre had fled the Empire. Lanre had gone mad. Some even said Lanre had killed himself and gone searching for his wife in the land of the dead. There were stories aplenty, but no one knew the truth of things. In the midst of these rumours, Lanre arrived in Myr Tariniel. He came alone, wearing his silver sword and haubergeon of black iron scales. His armour fits him closely as a second skin of shadow. He had wrought it from the carcass of the beast he had killed at Drossen Tor. Lanre asked Selitos to walk with him outside the city. Selitos agreed, hoping to learn the truth of Lanre's trouble and offer him what comfort a friend can give. They often kept each other's counsel, for they were both lords among their people. Selitos had heard the rumours and he was worried. He feared for Lyra's health, but more he feared for Lanre. Selitos was wise. He understood how grief can twist the heart, how passions drive good men to folly. Together, they walked the mountain paths. Lanre leading the way, they came to a high place in the mountains where they could look out over the land. The proud towers of Myr Tariniel shone brightly in the last light of the setting sun. After a long time, Selitos said, "I have heard terrible rumours concerning your wife." Lanre said nothing, and from his silence Selitos knew that Lyra was dead. After another long pause, Selitos tried again. "Though I do not know the whole of the matter, Myr Tariniel is here for you, and I will lend whatever aid a friend can give." "You have given me enough, old friend." Lanre turned and placed his hand on Selitos' shoulder. "Silanxi, I bind you. By the name of stone, be still as stone. Eru, I command the air. Lay leaden on your tongue. Selitos, I name you. May all your powers fail you but your sight." Selitos knew that in all the world there were only 3 people who could match his skill in names: Aleph, Ajax, and Lyra. Lanre had no gift for names. His power lay in the strength of his arm. For him to attempt to bind Selitos by his name would be as fruitless as a boy attacking a soldier with a willow stick. Nevertheless, Lanre's power lay on him like a great weight, like a vice of iron, and Selitos found himself unable to move or speak. He stood, still as stone, and could do nothing but marvel. How had Lanre come by such power? In confusion and despair, Selitos watched night settle in the mountains. With horror, he saw that some of the encroaching blackness was in fact a great army moving upon Myr Tariniel. Worse still, no warning bells were ringing. Selitos could only stand and watch as the army crept closer in secret. Myr Tariniel was burned and butchered. The less that is said of it, the better. The white walls were charred black, and the fountains ran with blood. For a night and a day, Selitos stood helpless beside Lanre and could do nothing more than watch and listen to the screams of the dying, the ring of iron, the crack of breaking stone. When the next day dawned on the blackened towers of the city, Selitos found he could move. He turned to Lanre, and this time his sight did not fail him. He saw in Lanre a great darkness and a troubled spirit, but Selitos still felt the fetters of enchantment binding him. Fury and puzzlement warred within him, and he spoke. "Lanre, what have you done?" Lanre continued to look out over the ruins of Myr Tariniel. His shoulders stooped as though he bore a great weight. There was a weariness in his voice when he spoke. Was I accounted a good man, Selitos? You were counted among the best of us. We considered you beyond reproach. Yet I did this. Selitos could not bring himself to look upon his ruined city. Yet you did this, he agreed. Why? Lanre paused. My wife is dead. Deceit and treachery brought me to it, but her death is on my hands. He swallowed and turned to look out over the land. Selitos followed his eyes. From the vantage, high in the mountains, he saw plumes of dark smoke rising from the land below. Selitos knew with certainty and horror that Myr Tariniel was not the only city that had been destroyed. Lanre's allies had brought about the ruin of the last bastions of the Empire. Lanre turned. And I counted among the best. Lanre's face was terrible to look upon. Grief and despair had ravaged it. I, considered wise and good, did all this. He gestured wildly. Imagine what unholy things a lesser man must hold within his secret heart. Lanre faced Myr Tariniel, and a sort of peace came over him. For them at least it is over. They are safe, safe from the thousand evils of the everyday, safe from the pains of an unjust fate. Selitos spoke softly. Safe from the joy and wonder. There is no joy, Lanre shouted in an awful voice. Stones shattered at the sound, and the sharp edges of echo came back to cut at them. Any joy that grows here is quickly choked by weeds. I am not some monster who destroys out of a twisted pleasure. I sow salt because the choice is between weeds and nothing. Selitos saw nothing but emptiness behind his eyes. Selitos stooped to pick up a jagged shard of mountain glass, pointed at one end. Will you kill me with a stone? Lanre gave a hollow laugh. I wanted you to understand, to know it was not madness that made me do these things. You are not mad, Selitos admitted. I see no madness in you. I hope perhaps that you would join me in what I aim to do. Lanre spoke with a desperate longing in his voice. This world is like a friend with a mortal wound. A bitter draught given quickly only eases pain. Destroy the world, Selitos said softly to himself. You are not mad, Lanre. What grips you is something worse than madness. I cannot cure you. He fingered the needle-sharp point of the stone he held. Will you kill me to cure me, old friend? Lanre laughed again, terrible and wild. Then he looked at Selitos with sudden, desperate hope in his hollow eyes. Can you? He asked. Can you kill me, old friend? Selitos, his eyes unveiled, looked at his friend. He saw how Lanre, nearly mad with grief, had sought the power to bring Lyra back to life again. Out of love for Lyra, Lanre had sought knowledge where knowledge is better left alone, and gained it at a terrible price. But even in the fullness of his hard-won power, he could not call Lyra back. Without her, Lanre's life was nothing but a burden, and the power he had taken up lay like a hot knife in his mind. To escape despair and agony, Lanre had killed himself, taking the final refuge of all men, attempting to escape beyond the doors of death. But just as Lyra's love had drawn him back from past the final door before, so this time Lanre's power forced him to return from sweet oblivion. His new won power burned him back into his body, forcing him to live. Selitos looked at Lanre and understood all. Before the power of his sight, these things hung like dark tapestries in the air about Lanre's shaking form. "I can kill you," Selitos said, then looked away from Lanre's expression, suddenly hopeful. "For an hour or a day, but you would return, pulled like iron to a loadstone. Your name burns with the power in you. I can no more extinguish it than I could throw a stone and strike down the moon." Lanre's shoulders bowed. "I had hoped," he said simply. "But I knew the truth. I am no longer the Lanre you knew. Mine is a new and terrible name. I am Haliax, and no door can bar my passing. All is lost to me. No Lyra, no sweet escape of sleep, no blissful forgetfulness, even madness is beyond me. Death itself is an open doorway to my power. There is no escape. I have only the hope of oblivion after everything is gone and the Aleu fall nameless from the sky." And as he said this, Lanre hid his face in his hands, and his body shook with silent, racking sobs. Selitos looked out on the land below and felt a small spark of hope. 6 plumes of smoke rose from the land below. Myr Tariniel was gone and 6 cities destroyed. But that meant all was not lost. 1 city still remained. In spite of all that had happened, Selitos looked at Lanre with pity, and when he spoke it was with sadness in his voice. "Is there nothing, then? No hope?" He lay one hand on Lanre's arm. "There is sweetness in life, even after all of this. I will help you look for it, if you will try." "No," said Lanre. He stood to his full height, his face regal behind the lines of grief. "There is nothing sweet. I will sow salt lest the bitter weeds grow." "I am sorry," Selitos said, and stood upright as well. Then Selitos spoke in a great voice. "Never before has my sight been clouded. I failed to see the truth inside your hearts." Selitos drew a deep breath. "By my eye I was deceived. Never again." He raised the stone and drove its needle point into his own eye. His scream echoed among the rocks as he fell to his knees, gasping, "May I never again be so blind!" A great silence descended, and the fetters of enchantment fell away from Selitos. He cast the stone at Lanre's feet and said, "By the power of my own blood I bind you. By your own name let you be accursed." Selitos spoke the long name that lay in Lanre's heart, and at the sound of it the sun grew dark and wind tore stones from the mountainside. Then Selitos spoke. "This is my doom upon you. May your face be always held in shadow, black as the toppled towers of my beloved Myr Tariniel. This is my doom upon you. Your own name will be turned against you, that you shall have no peace. This is my doom upon you and all who follow you. May it last until the world ends and the Aleu fall nameless from the sky." Selitos watched as a darkness gathered about Lanre. Soon nothing could be seen of his handsome features, only a vague impression of nose and mouth and eyes. All the rest was shadow, black and seamless. Then Selitos stood and said, "You have beaten me once through guile, but never again. Now I see truer than before, and my power is upon me. I cannot kill you, but I can send you from this place. Be gone! The sight of you is all the fouler, knowing that you once were fair." But even as he spoke them, the words were bitter in his mouth. Lanre, his face in shadow, darker than a starless night, was blown away like smoke upon the wind. Then Selitos bowed his head and wept hot tears of blood upon the earth.